My name is Joan Bowley, and I'm the president of the Historical Society. I'd like to introduce Jason Newton and his wife Dale, and we thank you, Jason, for doing this for us. I'm going to pass this over to Jason, and we'll enjoy, I'm sure. Thank you, Jason.
Well, it's officially good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here as part of the kickoff for Ashford's Tricentennial. I've been involved in a family history project that has brought me here to Ashford and through Ashford. I'll share some of that with you. I'm glad to be part of this Tricentennial celebration of the town. A couple things that I want to bring up, just so you're aware of. There are some programs. If you didn't get one, it has some information on a website that I've developed. It has links to the videos. There are like 5 videos, but if you haven't seen them, you can pretty much say, well, I'll go home without hearing Jason talk and watch his videos and see what he's had to say. And I won't run all the videos for you here so that you can do your homework. But the links are on here. And the other thing I want to bring your attention to is that the Conservation Commission in Ashford, along with the Last Green Valley, we're doing a walk on a portion of the Old Connecticut Path on October 20th, and we'll be leaving from the Fenton Ruby Park in Willington and going on up to the Langhammer Conservation Area in Ashford, following a portion of the Old Connecticut Path. My co-leaders are Charlotte Pyle and Gwen Holland, and we're going to try something that's a little bit of a mix of the history of the people who may have traveled along that route, along with the natural history that contributes to the beauty of the environment there. We were up there last weekend walking along the path, and it's a gorgeous area. It'll be about a mile walking on an old roadway up the hill to Langhammer. And those who would like to walk it back, you can walk back and imagine being among that group of early pioneers that came down to settle in Connecticut. Let your imaginations work. Those who have questions, Gwen, Charlotte and I will be able to walk with you back and answer questions as we're coming down the hill. So it's an invitation for you as part of the Last Green Valley Walktober. The information is in the brochure, and I hope you'll come on out and join us. Now, as I said, Ashford's coming up on its Tricentennial. I understand some of the activities, and maybe this is one of the first ones publicly, but there are a number that are planned during the year. And I have some confessions that I have to make here. Every time I do this presentation, depending on where I am, I do it a little bit differently. And since I'm coming to Ashford, it had to be very different. That there's some truth that I have to tell you about what I knew about Ashford before I got into this project. What I knew about Ashford was that you had a motel that you passed very fast on Route 84. Because I'd never been to Ashford prior to that, other than going by on 84, so I really was unaware of most of what was here. I'm glad that that's changed over the last few years in the course of this family history project. I'm going to share some things that, they say that, if you go back far enough, we're all related. Doing this project, I found that I have a lot of cousins out there. As I do presentations in Connecticut, there are a lot of folks, and I found a lot of folks out there across the country that have contacted me as they've learned about this. I've got a lot of cousins, and I'll share a little bit of the family history as it comes back to Ashford, because there are a lot of connections there. And it really goes kind of, there's a thing on 6 degrees of separation. They say if you work 6 connections back, you can almost connect to anyone. And I'm going to shake the family tree and show you some of my Ashford connections. And they really came through. I have some wonderful old pictures, and I see some in your calendar of family members from Ashford. I have some old family pictures, and it's nice to be able to connect with people from 100, 150 years ago and see them. And these are my grandparents, Irwin Newton and Lydia Dimmick, and through them I have so many connections to Ashford. We'll go through 6 degrees of them anyway. And by shaking the family tree and turning it upside down, one of the first connections that I want to share with you as part of your history is that my ancestor Nathaniel Woodward came through here, probably just out where the road is here in 1642, on a survey commissioned by the colony of Massachusetts. They were looking to set up a boundary for Massachusetts and Connecticut. And we know from his survey map, they were able to take latitude and longitude on their journey across from Providence up to Windsor. So we have a pretty good idea of the route that they followed in 1642. So the map is up, a copy of the map is up in the Massachusetts archives up in Boston. I get to see. This is an interpretation of it, and let's see if I can make this work. You all know where Phoenixville, Ashford, you can see Warrenville made it right on the map here. So 1642, he came across along with Solomon Safry, and their survey initiated probably about 200 years of warfare between Massachusetts and Connecticut. Why was that? They established the boundary up here. So those of you who are from the north end of town, up in Westward and beyond, had this held up, you would be celebrating 300 years in Massachusetts. So there's one of my first ones of connection historically to Ashford. This next one, I was surprised to come up with this fellow David Jacob from Ipswich. He and some others, John Cushing and Samuel Clapp. In 1707, they purchased 15 square miles just west of Woodstock and established the New Scituate Plantation, which is right down here. And just to give you some idea where we are in New Scituate, we're right about here. So this lower corner of New Scituate was the property or the land that they purchased. They liked it so much that in 1708 they purchased the rest of the town, 21,400 acres. And they never lived here. The land was becoming available after the King Philip's War, and a lot of these land tracts were being purchased up on large tracts, and then they were subdivided. And the subdivision goes on even today. So we could say subdivision began with them, and it's here with us today. Now, another connection I came across here, and I don't know if we have any Dimmicks here in the hall or anyone that says, I know Dimmicks. That's one of my family connections, and the story with the Dimmick family is that Elder Thomas came over and wound up settling in Barnstable, and he had to get out of England quietly because his great-grandfather was the King's champion, which was a royal position. As I found out, that it basically entailed whenever there was a new king, the champion had to stand up and say, who challenges this person to be king? Does anyone speak up and want to challenge it? Along with the position came a land grant in England. And tracing it back, the position and the line of family went back to William the Conqueror before he was the Conqueror, when he was in France. So his son Shubile came to Mansfield and was one of the founders of Mansfield down at Pond Village, which is in Mansfield Center. And his children, some of them came right up the Mount Hope River here, and Timothy Dimmick would be like a cousin. He wasn't my direct. Settled here in 1718. It's probably here before that time. And looking at the Dimmick family history, there's a whole bunch of them here there were, and there may still be, in Ashford, Tolland, Mansfield, Coventry. They had lots of children and they spread out. And they migrated from here, like many of the families did early on, up to Vermont, where my family migrated to. Interesting, some of the Dimmicks migrated to Nova Scotia, and the Canada Dimmicks stemmed through this family here in Ashford and Mansfield. But in looking at up in the library, the Ashford 1789, that must have been the 275th anniversary. There's moments from history. And in there I found more connections that the Dimmicks were here in Ashford and served with Colonel Thomas Knowlton at Bunker Hill, and they were part of the Knowlton Rangers. And Knowlton, the statue here is from down by the Connecticut State House. So he was a hero of Bunker Hill and the Battle of Harlem in New York with George Washington. So they were serving with him. And one last connection, I know you have a program, a great program coming up on the ancient cemeteries of Ashford and doing things to help preserve them. I found a Dimmick buried up on there, and it's an Aurelia Dimmick. And she was just less than 10 years old. And her story was, as you start digging in, everyone in one of these old graveyards, there's a family story there. She died at an early age, and her family, her parents moved to Vermont and then west. So she's left up there in the Westward Cemetery, buried next to the stone of her grandparents. Another one of my shaking the trees here is Seth Hodges. He was actually born here, so it's one of my directs, in 1765. Stayed here for a period of time, and then his family moved up to Vermont. And like many of those who came early, they served in the Revolutionary War. But he was one of our family members through which there were a lot of the Mayflower connections. And these are the families that he and I share, I guess, as connections to the Mayflower. And one of the things that, as I said with the Dimmicks, they came from Barnstable up to Mansfield, and they came here. There was a migration of people who came from Plymouth Colony to this area, into Ashford. And if we go right out here onto Route 44 and head east, and we follow it right to the beginning of Route 44, we are at the Mayflower. So in Ashford's history, in the history of this area, you have strong currents coming in from Plymouth Colony that have those connections back to the ancestors who came on the Mayflower in the earliest years, in addition to those who came down from the Massachusetts Bay along the course of the Old Connecticut Path. I have another curious connection here, and I'll share it with you real quickly. My great-grandmother, we're fortunate that she had a family photo album. And these are a couple of the photos from it, and they're beautiful photos, and they actually had names on them, which is one of those things that you go, who was that? Well, I had the who was it, but I didn't have all the relationships. So the arresting image of the young girl here is the daughter of Lizzie Snow Newton, whose father was Calvin Newton, would be my great-great-grandfather. Connection with Ashford was that Calvin was living up in Pomfret, Vermont, and where did he come for his wife, Sarepta Whipple? He came to Ashford. So even though there was this separation of distance, folks who migrated to Vermont still maintained a connection 100 years or more afterwards, coming back and marrying into families in Connecticut. Sarepta is one of the Whipples. I understand the cemetery is hidden up in the Scout Reservation here in Ashford. And she was, her mother was Mary Chaffee. So that's another, see where I'm throwing names out here, it's like, okay, you see her a name that you say is an Ashford name that you know. you can start making connections. Well, the reason I don't have Sarepta's picture is that Calvin and Sarepta went west. They went to Iowa in 1836. And Sarepta died there in Denmark, Iowa in 1840. And Calvin and his two children, Lizzie and his other son, and their son, was an 8-week journey by wagon back from Iowa to Vermont. He decided, I don't want to stay there. And he came back to Vermont, and so his second wife, you'd think, well, gee, if he's coming back to Vermont, this family connection, he'll find a second wife. And that wasn't unusual, that you'd see that men would have married maybe twice, sometimes 3 times, because of death during childbirth, and that women would die much younger than the men. Calvin came back down, just downstream here in Wyndham, and that's where he married my great-great-grandmother. So we have another Connecticut connection there. But one of the things that was one of our family stories about Lizzie, and I was able to piece this together, that Lizzie and her husband and her daughter, they lived in Hartford down on Farmington Ave. Family story that was passed down through my great-grandmother, my father endlessly told it, that Lizzie had coffee visits by their neighbor. And he'd come into the house, and you know who Mark Twain here. He'd come into the house and he'd say, Mrs. Newton, my wife says a proper gentleman doesn't leave the house without a tie. Reached in his pocket and says, there's the damn tie. Well, there's another connection with him, now that I've told you. The story is now past another generation here with that. In the course of the research on this project, I found that Mark Twain, or Sam Clemens, in 1874 decided with a friend he was going to take a walk to Boston from Hartford. And so they set out on foot in November of 1874, you can imagine, up the Center Turnpike. They went up through Holland, and they were stopping basically at all the taverns along the way. I'm sure there were a good many stories that he'd tell and stories he'd heard. And he stopped for the night up here in Westward at the tavern. He was pretty worn out by that point, so the next 6 miles over to North Ashford, where he wound up spending the next night. By then, he just was worn out. It was so cold, they wound up taking a wagon on down to Fabian to catch the train. I'm sure that many stories were told. He was probably bought many drinks along the way, and I'm sure there were more than a few up here in Westford where he passed some time with the folks of Ashford. And I'm pretty sure he probably traveled without the tie. Which brings me to my 6th degree of separation, which I came upon more by accident than anything else. How many of you have seen this? Have you been there? Well, that's good, because I went by and I saw a blurb on the road, and I'm going, oh, there's a marker there. Oh, well, what's that? I turn around and go look, and sure enough, it's a trail marker for John Oldham, 1634, Pastor John Wareham, 1635, and Thomas Hooker in 1636. And I think in my following of this is the one that brings all 3 towns of Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford together in a monument in one place. And as I was doing this, it's my degrees of separation. Among the founders of those 3 towns, I have a whole bunch of folks who are my ancestors that are direct connections. And one of the things that I found in going along the path, and I put these names up there not to say, gee, you know, I'm related to a lot of people. But what I found as I go around and I'm doing presentations is that the names ring bells of connections that people in Eastford, and I'm hoping here in Ashford, they did over in Holland and Vernon, they start saying, yeah, I've got some of those people in my family, and they are connected to this route of travel. Now, the main connection that I was following is that I'm a descendant of Thomas Hooker, and pretty directly. You know, I don't have to go too far to be able to make the connection. And up on the State House, there's an image of the march to, Thomas Hooker's march to Hartford, and shows his wife laid out on a stretcher, and there's some folks that said, well, she was an invalid. Well, in looking at this story, part of it is that, you know, the folks who are coming down to Connecticut, and the folks who came over in the Great Migration to Massachusetts, they came with families. And Thomas Hooker came in 1636. He and his wife Susanna had 5 children. And 3 of the 5 were 6, 5, and 2, almost 3 years old. And when I did a little research on the youngest, Samuel, there, it looks like Susanna Hooker, on their journey coming across, was either pregnant during the 2-month period that they were on the ocean coming across from England, or had just given birth. So I kind of think that maybe that whole thing with the litter and being carried might have been an accommodation for someone who had a very young child, and might have put, you know, Susanna might have just put her foot down and saying to Tom, you know, Tom, listen, I just came across 2 months on the ocean. I was pregnant. Now you want me to walk to Hartford? So it might have been an accommodation. But they came as families, and in digging into this, there's very little. They did not tend to keep diaries or journals. But we have the journal of Governor John Winthrop, who noted in May 31, 1636, that the pastor of Newtown and his congregation went to Connecticut with 160 cows. They left from the Common in Cambridge across from Harvard. So you can go down there and visit. There's a marker there today. There are actually 3 markers there. There are the 3 things of significance that you may want to pay attention to that had national significance for our country. The first would be, certainly the folks from Harvard would say, the university was founded in 1636. It's the premier university in the world, and you know, we have claim to great influence on America. The second was that there's a monument there for George Washington assuming command of the Continental Army in 1775, establishing the chain of command of the military is under the direction of the elected body. And the third was as a small marker about Thomas Hooker leaving for Connecticut. They followed really a corridor, probably should be thought of more as a corridor down to Connecticut, using Indian trails. And I say a corridor because there were probably thousands of trails that they could select from, and depending on the weather, the conditions, they might go one way one time and another way another, or branch and come back. There seemed to be a lot of branching and coming back to a central corridor. But they followed a trail that was part of a network, and the natives actually had a number of routes that were long-distance travel routes that they'd follow. And this was one of them, from the Massachusetts Bay on down to the Connecticut Valley. And I didn't grow up with this. It was when I started digging into the project that I realized the role of Thomas Hooker as, you know, he was a scholar at Cambridge University, reformer, founder of Hartford, statesman. He worked across the colonies. And this thing, father of American democracy, which, you know, we'll get to here. In England, the times before he came to America was a time of great upheaval for the Puritans, and a period of conflict that actually led to Hooker's final words were that his sermon was, "There will be a war in England." And he was correct. In the 1640s and 50s, there was a civil war that broke out in England, and it was a bloody war. There were, they say the U.S. Civil War was our bloodiest, and if we said, gee, adjusting it to today's population in the United States, the Civil War would have been, our Civil War would have been like having 7 million casualties. The English Civil War, if we adjusted it so we get a sense of scale, it would have been in the range of 14 million casualties. So it was a very difficult time, religious, economic, political, and much was reshaped as part of that process. And some of the abuses that were going on, the abuses of power that were happening in England, Thomas Hooker and the groups that came down to Connecticut were really interested in correcting and creating, in their minds, a new England. Because the old England, they tried to fix it, it couldn't be fixed in their time. And what happened in England during that period in the Civil War and the corrections really had an effect on shaping the roots of the American Revolution. They came down, and Thomas Hooker, in his role as a leader, gave a lecture in May 1638, about 2 years after they set out from Cambridge, to the freemen of Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield. And he sat down and he used a passage from Deuteronomy to set down what is it that's the task that they were there to consider. And it was built around choosing wise leaders. I have to stop and say, I wonder how many people would listen to Thomas Hooker today, choosing wise leaders in our present circumstances. But he set down first principle. It's the people who have the right to choose and to set up the government. And that it's God's gift, which was a radical change. And that the franchise that they're given as part of this gift is one that has to be exercised with care, not to get drawn into things that would lead for their own gain, would be concerned for the whole of the community, for the good of all. And the leaders and the government could have limits. If they did not meet their duty in serving well, that the people had the right to remove them. So the concern was that the leader's duty was to serve for the good of the whole, not the particular special interest, but the good of the whole congregation and the whole community. There was much discussion going on between that time and of his lecture. In January 1649, we'll be coming up on the 375th anniversary. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut were ratified. And within the Fundamental Orders, there were protections that were provided that really amounted to the first written constitution that became the foundation of one of the precursors of our own Constitution. In doing this research and on early history and filling in the gaps in my own knowledge, what they did was the American Revolution may have really begun in the adoption of the fundamental orders and the process they went through. And there were two pieces of it. There was the preamble, which if you read it, sets down a divine purpose. The purpose is to create a godly or just society. And important in this is understanding the subtext that there was a transfer of authority. Governments in the past, prior to that, either came through the prophets, religious prophets, or down through the kings. And here the power was coming through the people, as Thomas Hooker establishes there. The people have been given a gift from God to do this. And the orders establish a rule of the people. And if you read the corrections that they did, when I was reading it, knowing the history in England, they were attempting to correct for the problems that were in England in the fundamental orders. throughout this, and the reason I say this is probably this group of people initiated the American Revolution, was that nowhere in this was there any mention of the government's established with the authority of the king. The government was established with the authority of the people. And the descendants are seen, as you read, if you read closely, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Articles of Confederation. They all had strong Connecticut connections. So I went out and I'm looking a little further. We'll get to your part of it here in Ashford. That led me here is that, fortunately, across Massachusetts, there are a good many signs that you can find that are historic markers to show the way. There was great interest in this party in Massachusetts. And there are some places, like here in Ashford, that there's actually a monument in Connecticut showing the passage of this group of people on down to Connecticut. In the 1930s, Harold Ayers was among those who was researching the route of the Connecticut Path, and he came and spent a good bit of time here in Ashford. And he was able to establish, and it seems to make sense, that they followed down to Woodstock the routes that would have been used by John Eliot, who established praying Indian villages. And Woodstock was about the furthest reach that John Eliot was able to make in establishing the praying villages in his lifetime. So there was a gap to be able to fill in from Woodstock on down. And in doing the pieces and figuring this out, transferring it, I think you can follow the route fairly closely today. And if you go to the website, you'll be able to see where the route is. They were able to travel about 10 miles a day, I figure. Given there are 100 or more people walking of all ages and driving 160 cows, you can't go too fast. And anyone who walks in the woods, you'll say, 10 miles walking in the woods is a long day. So they would have traveled probably out to just beyond 128 to Weston, down to Framingham, and if you go on the Mass Turnpike towards Boston, as you get to Framingham, look up, you'll see a bridge across that says Old Connecticut Path. It's one of the places where they actually say it came through here. And the road is named Old Connecticut Path. On to Whitehall and Hopkinton, there's a tradition that they camp there. And down, I figure, down into the area of Sutton. Then to Webster, Woodstock. Pine Hill has a tradition which you'll hear about here in Ashford. Then down to the Willimantic, and then their last days following the Tankerhoosen and the Hockenham Valley on down to the Connecticut River crossing. And the crossing was, we believe, is probably right about where the I-84 bridge is. There's a sandbar there, so the cattle could have been driven pretty far across the river. They probably had boats to go take them. There's some variation over time. There's been, I'd say, after Ayers' book came out, there was some really heated discussion of, well, they went this way or they went that way. They agreed that they went down to Woodstock, but there was a highway and a low way. The low way pretty much followed what you have out here as Route 44, came down to Eastford from Woodstock, and then followed Route 44 out through Bolton Notch and down to Connecticut. The highway, which I've been following, is the one that comes across up through Westford here in town. I'll explain some of the reasons. I think that might have been one of the early routes. Again, we don't have GPS. It would have been great if they had GPS or if they took notes or drew maps. They had none of that, so we have to try to just piece it together and say, well, how do we think they could have done it? One of the clues that we have is from Ellen Larned, who in 1874, Ellen Larned was the founder of the library over in Thompson, and she was the first woman to be admitted as a member of the Connecticut Historical Society. One of her accomplishments was writing the history of Windham County, which was published now. In my research, I went up to the Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and right inside the book, there was this map. You fold out the map and it looks like a treasure map. It was her map of ancient Windham County, and on it, she had drawn, based on her collection of the stories that she heard from folks back in the 1870s and earlier, about where the course of the Old Connecticut Path was by tradition known at that time. And just real quick, it comes down through Thompson, across Woodstock, down to Crystal Pond, and there you see coming across, the section coming across Eastford. This particular map, and in your brochure you'll see it, there are a number of places that I found that are open public places that you can go to walk. And if you go on the website, there's a place that you can go on the website that I shared with you and put up there some maps and some directions on how to get there, so you can go out and explore it for yourselves. But zooming in here on Ashford, just to give you some reference using Larned's map, you can see some of the places to get an idea. Where was it that she was thinking approximately this crossed? And he'd come up with, it came across, well, there's Crystal Pond and Bigelow Brook. And then it was above the place where Boston Hollow Brook comes into the Mount Hope River, so we're pointing it towards, uphill towards, going towards Westward. And across Westford Hill, you can see Moulton Brook there going across. And again, those numbers and references there relate to places that you can go to visit that are on the path. Something that helped in this process was really digging a little bit further from Larned. She gave a general indication of where the path would be. Again, I'm share your Westford Cemetery and the people who you'll find. This is not an ancestor, this is a resident of a family that had many roots here in town. Lots of children, and it seems as though they had lots of other children and cousins, and they're related to just about everybody, I guess. That's what I'm getting the sense of. Two of them that Harold Ayers came in contact with were David and Charles Chisholm. And they lived up on Axe Factory Road off of Eastford Road in Ashford, or Westford. Somewhere in the 1920s, David Chisholm, who seemed to have been the collector of the lore of the path, laid out a map that was published, and I don't know where the newspaper is that was published, but the map, I found a copy of it down at the Connecticut State Library, and I have it up on the website too, so you can take a look at it. Is his contribution, and one of the beauties of it is that he took Larned's history and he laid it on a Keeney map, and the map actually has place names of houses and people that lived along the route. So if you look a little closer, you can see it running from Crystal Pond, going up over to Bigelow Brook, and then making a kind of a long diagonal down to right where the monument is, and then cutting across to over Moulton Brook and on down towards Willington. Now along the way, Ayers not only had a map from David Chisholm, David Chisholm had died prior to Ayers coming to Ashford on his research, but David Chisholm was still around, and he gave a statement of, here's the places along the path, and I've listed some of the family names here, again, because you folks probably might have some connections to the folks that were mentioned in this description. So after this, if you go out and do your own research and walking, you can connect this with residents of the town and places. And we'll kind of cut across the Dolly place. Frank Dolly is where the monument was set on Route 89. And up the top of the hill is the Charles Chisholm house. They called it Codfish Flats, and it took me a while to figure out that was Lips Road. Different names, different times. We'll take a quick run through these places, just so you get a sense of the continuity of it. Crystal Pond is one of the beautiful places to walk in the conservation area there. The path from there comes right across, so the line seemed to come across just about where Buell Orchards is, but came across the orchards, through the woods and down across Ashford Road in Eastford. It gets confusing when you're going to Ashford and Eastford because Eastford was part of Ashford, and then they had kind of a mutual separation in 1847. So they're like the child of Ashford. I figured if Eastford's the child of Ashford, then North Ashford must feel like the orphan. They must be really confused up there. But you come down across Ashford Road and the Buell Farm, down across Branch Brook. And doing this and looking at the history, there were a lot of folks' names that I came up with that went down to Hartford and Windsor and Wethersfield. And their children's children, some of them wound up back here, like the Buells are among the founders of Windsor. So you'll find as you go down through, there were some of the folks who actually came back from the Connecticut Valley. Buell Brook crossing, and took a little bit to figure the Branch Brook crossing. About the area where the geography, the physical layout of the land would accommodate crossing. And from there, this is Cozy Road. We begin to get into some of the landmarks that Charles Chisholm described. The Highland Place, and the Shippey Place, and the school. And we'll take a look at some of those. The Highland Place, I don't know who lives there now, but the house and the farm are still there. Charles described just east of Walker Road, there was a narrow strip of land. Back up. There were two ponds. There's a pond there, and there's a larger beaver pond here. And between them, there was a strip of land that he knew, and this would have gone back to the 1870s, where the path crossed between the ponds. I don't recommend this as casual walking. I put it as about a difficulty level of 9, like you got to be crazy. It's overrun with barberry. But the strip of land is there. You could see that it would be crossed. And there was a tendency, we've got to remember this, when they came in the 1600s, it was the age of the beaver. We all know how troublesome beavers can be. But if you leave them totally unchecked, they take over the landscape. So you have to work around them. And there were places that the route had to actually cross either on the dams or right below them to be able to get through. In early, Charles indicated there were two landmarks along Walker Road. One of them was the Shippey Place, which was an old farmhouse, and the Shippey family I found was, they still seem to be around in some way in Eastford. And right down the street, he said that the path ran between the Shippey Place and the Schoolhouse. And I found the book that you have up here in the library, a picture of the 12th District School that Charles and David Chisholm, and I'm presuming his brothers and sisters, they walked to. It was about a mile to walk down to from their home on Axe Factory. It's not there now, obviously. What you will find if you walk in is that you will find the remains of the doorstep and the foundation. Talking with the folks over in Eastford, the school was actually moved sometime probably after the turn of 1900s. It was moved over to Ashford Road. It was used as a school for a period of time, then they sold it, and it's now still there as a private residence on Ashford Road. History of the town here, it shows that a school was established there in the early 1700s, in the early period of settlement here in Ashford. It goes back to the earliest times of Ashford. One other piece there I want to say is that it started a little scavenger hunt for me in search of, it was donated by, the picture was donated by a woman named Esther Fabian, and there are still Fabians here in town. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Charles and David, he said they walked down from their house on Axe Factory. They followed the old road down and walked across the bridge over the Bigelow, they call it a river. It's now on the map as a brook, which is, it should be a river. And you go up there, it's pretty big. They walked across the bridge, and what remains there is the foundation. And he said, about 50, 60 feet above the bridge, there were a series of stones laid across the river. And here's one of them. And he said, he and his brother David, there were many times when they were walking to school or coming home that they'd used those to step across the river. And the lore was that those were there as part of the path. Now you see, right now you only see one, and I came across a letter from Harold Ayers that he wrote to Lloyd Williams over in Woodstock in the 1950s, and he described going down there with Morris Bicknell after Charles Chisholm passed away. And the stones weren't there. Well, in 1938, we all know we've come up to that anniversary too. In 1938, we had the hurricane in 1938, and that flood picked up many of the stones and carried them away, so that it's very likely that you'll find the ones that they were describing, the one that's there, have been pushed downstream. But Ayers had walked across the river with Charles in 1935 or 36. And Morris Bicknell, who is another one of your families that has a connection with the path, took Ayers down there again. So we have that connection of a piece that's in the woods on one side in Eastford, it's in the Natchitoches State Forest. The other side is private land right now. Another piece of the puzzle is this whole thing in Pine Hill. I said, there was a story that Larned reported that the tradition is that their Hooker's party, their encampment was on Pine Hill in Ashford. And there were some who said, well, that meant over here, up at the center of town in Ashford. This is from, again, the history of Ashford, the glimpses of Ashford, that there was a map in 1833 that shows Pine Hill was really kind of an area in Ashford, up in the northern end along the Bigelow Brook or Bigelow River. And just as a reference, here's the school that Charles and David went to, and the road that they followed, and the Chisholm farm. And the scale is a little bit off in the drawing, but the Chisholm farm was there. And in doing the research on this, Charles Chisholm said, the farm, their farm was where the Hooker party camped. That was the Pine Hill. And doing the research and tracking down this Esther Fabian, I found her son, Tom, who lives over in Eastford, and he said, oh yes, that's Pine Hill was where the Baptist meetings were at the turn of the century. There's a picture with the caption that says, a Bible meeting on Pine Hill on Axe Factory Road. And not only did he say that they meet there, he said he still owns the land. So it's near the corner of Axe Factory Road and Eastford Road, in that corner. Let's see if we can get this. One of the other pieces that was there that Charles described was that there was a strip of land across their farm that had never been plowed, and their tradition was that that was where the path went across. And this is a view from Eastford Road looking up the hill towards Pine Hill. It's recently been cut, so you can see a little through the woods. There's a stone wall along the top of the hill. And I went to take a look there, and there's actually the old road, Colonial Era Road, that runs parallel to Eastford Road, but it runs right along the ridge. And it's a good 500 feet long in this section, and it runs to the east. It would have run by the Chisholm farm, and then connected on down to what's now a private drive going down to Bigelow Brook. And to the west, it travels along in parallel to Eastford Road. Oops, the wrong button here. And just a little beyond, going west on North Chisholm Brook, there's an old mill site. Probably a trip hammer or a simple mill there along the brook. And the road continues, or the path continues to come over and cross Eastford Road and leads down to it. Any of you have been on the Nipmuc Trail and have passed the sign where it joins with the Natchog Trail? That section of the Nipmuc Trail that comes downhill to Boston Hollow Brook, I figure it's just about where Chisholm was describing on his map and the description of where the Old Connecticut Path was. And crossing there, let me bring it back, crossing the brook, and then instead of following the trail now runs down to Iron Mine. Just following the curve of Grass Hill to come out at the Dolly place where the monument is. And I did try to track this, and it is walkable. A good portion is in the Natchog State Forest, but you do have to respect the fact that it also crosses into private land. And that leads us to the answer of how that monument got there. In 1960, and again, thanks to the work of the Historical Society in collecting these things for the 275th anniversary, we find the monument that was set there, and we have Morris Bicknell, and a state official, according to the caption, there with the monument. And you can see today, if you go there again, it's private lands on both sides, but the driveway up the hill and down the hill going towards the Mount Hope River are about where the description was of the path. Now, this is one of my other true confessions that as a psychologist, we're supposed to learn that correlation is not causation. When I went looking, I came across this really neat 500-foot long Great Wall. It happened to run parallel to the route of the path from the monument down to the river. Yeah. And it is a great wall. But as they say, sometimes a wall is just a wall. I was drawing, well, maybe it was something that went much earlier. It probably is in the last 150 years it was constructed. But a double wall, which means two sides filled in. It's huge. The amount of labor that goes into building walls is incredible. And we see thousands of miles of walls. So we know there's lots of work. And looking for the crossing on the Mount Hope River, one of the things that stands out on the highway, and I got to move right along here quickly, the Mount Hope River just across the street here last December looked like this. Looking upstream from Route 44. The Mount Hope River at Oaks Road on the same day, you can see there's a tremendous advantage of a path, a footpath, before there were any bridges, being on the highland because crossings would be much easier and safer. So that's probably where my thinking in following across on the upper side of through the highlands makes more sense for an early travel route. Walking up the Mount Hope River, this is a beautiful photo. Oh, gee, I was able to walk across this. This is in the area of the crossing. And I like this picture enough so that I submitted it to the Connecticut Historical Society, and hopefully they'll put it on exhibit as one of the places on the Old Connecticut Path. And from there it goes up over Westward Hill. There's a description of it crossing a field up on Westward Hill, and you can see traces. There's a track leading up to the place where it comes out near the Chisholm and Whitten farm on Lips Road. Kind of threw me going across because Chisholm described, there was a path kind of through the cedar swamp or a wet area. And I've since learned that the pond that I passed was formerly part of the cedar swamp. And then my search led me to try and come up with a solution down what is the old Howey Road, which is a beautiful piece of land. One of the places along there that is in my list for walking here in Ashford is the Legal Farm Woods, and owned by Joshua Trust, and there is the Fern Glade Trail there. Beautiful area to walk in along Knowlton Brook. And again, those name connections of Colonel Knowlton. and walking up a portion of Howie Road from the Fleagle Farm just captures that early New England. There aren't too many places you find nice dirt roads to walk that are like this, lined by maples, looking out over the vista of the farmlands here in Connecticut. And this leads down to the area that's currently in work with the Langhammer property that the town of Ashford owns, and is currently in process of looking at how to open this area for people to enjoy the beauty of the land there with some trails. These photos I took from, I borrowed from Gwen Holland in her collection. It's just a beautiful little wilderness area there. And it's hidden away at the end of Lustig Road. And we'll be visiting this on our walk on October 20th. And the last comes downhill following Howie and Taylor Road. A beautiful walk right down to the Fenton Ruby Conservation Area of Wilmington. It does go on. I figured ways to get across Wilmington. It took a while to figure out where the old roads were, but there really was another track that has since fallen by the way. So what happened to Mary Hooker's, to the story here? I'll try and wrap this up with questions. In telling this story, I always wondered, why aren't we hearing about this story? People coming across the ocean, giving up their homes, the journey that they made through the woods, 2 weeks through the woods, the wilderness, the hardships they endured. Why don't we hear about this? I think it was because, in those days of oral tradition, they'd sit down by the fire and tell stories. They tell the children, their grandchildren, tell us about grandparents, how they came to this country, tell us, the story of our coming. But those children and their children's children, and you'll see this in the history of the people here in Ashford that came early, is one that they migrated. They didn't just come and settle. They continued the westward expansion of America. And my ancestors and many from Connecticut made the trip to Vermont and then spread from there. Others went up through New York and on into the Midwest and even on up the Platte River and all the way across the country to the Pacific. And along their way, I think that story of journeys certainly was carried over, and it got translated to each generation about their journey. So it wasn't the journey from England, it was the journey from Connecticut. And it became the journey from Vermont and the journey from Iowa, and it kept getting changed and handed down. Part of this thing that I've been chasing with the story is the first people who came had really a hard journey. What kept them going? What really gave them the drive to do what they did, give up the comforts that they had, and take on this trip into the wilderness. And there were a couple of clues that I found along the way that are here in Connecticut. The first is in the shield of the symbols for Connecticut include the vines. And the vines represent, as I found out, and you probably are all aware of this, is the tribes of Israel that were brought out of Egypt. They were transplanted from Egypt. The other piece was that the state motto, which I won't try to, my Latin slipped a little bit, but it means, "He who brought us will sustain us." And in looking at Scripture, I found a passage that's particularly lovely from Deuteronomy, and going back to Thomas Hooker and his lecture to the freemen before the establishment of the fundamental orders, he took from Deuteronomy. So this would have been well known to them. And it's the story, again, from Scripture of He brought us out of, what shall we tell our children? Tell them that God brought us out of Egypt and the bondage and slavery we had there. And He brought us to this good land. And if we make and keep His laws, then God will preserve us here and make us prosperous. And that story, you take that story from Scripture and you think of Puritans whose belief was that they should live in accord with Scripture. That those people who came to Connecticut with Thomas Hooker in those early 70s, I truly believe they were living their life, and they believed strongly that they were living consistent with the Scripture. And because they had done that, that God had brought them out of the bondage and the persecution of England and brought them to this land promised to the ancestors. And this beautiful land here in Connecticut and this beautiful land in America is that promised land, and that should be preserved and kept. And thinking in my own family, you've heard a lot about two of my ancestors, my grandparents. Others, my other grandparents, one came from Quebec in a farm down to Manchester. The other came from Scotland and was the mechanic that maintained the mills in Manchester. They came much later, but they came because there was a promise of a better life. And they came to share in this land that was promised. My wife, we traveled to Poland, and we had the good fortune to find her grandfather's place of birth out on the plains in Poland. As a young man, he heard the story. I think he heard the story of America on one side, and he heard the story of the Tsar's army coming to conscript him. But he chose the promise of America. Dale's grandmother came from Lithuania as a 17-year-old girl who spoke no English, and came through Ellis Island. Came because there was no opportunity at home. She came for the promise of America. So we have people who came much later, but they came to be part of the story, which I think really began very early on and connects with the people who came down to Connecticut and started this American Revolution. It became part of the American story. So as you look at your own ancestors, maybe there'd be some folks that you've heard about here that they ring the names of your ancestors, or as you look at the calendar that the Historical Society has and you see the people there, and you start looking at the people who came before you, and you ask yourself, what was it that sustained them in coming to giving up the life they had to come to America and be part of it? I think that there's something that connects you and your ancestors with this journey and with this story. Give me a moment. The story is one I think you want to share, and I hope that you'll be able to do this as you go out and walk some here in Connecticut. One of the things that I brought up with the Connecticut Forest and Parks folks last June at their meeting was, you have all the, you have the Appalachian Trail, you've got the National Recreation Trail, you've got the Washington-Rochambeau Trail. Wouldn't it be nice by 2036 or thereabouts, when we're talking about the 400th anniversary of the folks coming to Connecticut, that we had a recognition of the Connecticut Path and the founding families that came. And I'm really happy to be here in Ashford, because much of the route that cuts across your town is either now open or comes close to areas that were the, I'm mapping as the trail. And in Eastford, there's public land in the Natchog State Forest that leads right up to Bigelow Brook and down to the river. There's private land that leads, private drive leading up to Eastford Road. I wish this map was a little bit better for you. And then the Natchog Trail and the Nipmuc Trail give a nice corridor across a good portion of Ashford. And they either are on or closely parallel to the route of the Old Connecticut Path. And the last sections that we have connection that We have the section along Howie Road from Knowlton Brook and Fleagle Farm. There's a small disconnect that some folks are looking at it to see if it could be connected, but otherwise there's a route that would lead from Knowlton Brook on down to Fenton Ruby. So there's some good portions that are currently open. The Conservation Commission and perhaps the Historical Society and some other groups here in town are looking at ways to make this open or make the connection of these places with the history. You have wonderful lands where you can walk and experience a world that may be close to what those folks coming in the very earliest years might have experienced. So I'll close in saying again, we're going to be having on October 20th, 2 weeks from now on Sunday, October 20th, a walk from the start over at Fenton Ruby. We'll walk a portion of the path. We'll talk some about the history and some of the natural history of the environment. And hopefully invite folks to come out and have a chance to experience the world and let their imaginations work, the world that might have been traveled by those pioneers. So I want to thank the Historical Society, the library, the Babcock Library, and all you folks for coming out today. I hope that through this you have some closer connection to people who came before in the land that you all have come to love here in Ashford. So thank you.
Any questions?
Go right ahead.
I'd like to make a comment about the Great Wall of Ashford. There is a rather romantic story going around that somebody built the Great Wall so that Hooker and his party could cross the swamp. Have you heard that?
I probably was the one that started that. That's why I made the confession.
Actually, my grandfather helped build that wall, okay?
Great.
He was born in 1880, so I'm sure he didn't work on it when he was 7 years old. It had to be around the turn of the century. That's about the time period when the Great Wall was built. They were clearing the buckland.
See, and that's something that, I've learned I have to be careful with my imagination.
Yes.
And that was probably the biggest of my oopses, and why I wanted to especially come clean with folks. So, there's so much other history that you want to make sure that people don't go, well, you got that wrong, so everything else is wrong. But it is something that I don't know, it must have been about 1 million pounds of stone that was put into that wall, and mostly was done by hand.
It was.
So that you have to think, and you go out, and I read some Thornton, Dr. Thornton, I think it's Thornton, over at UConn, Thorson. At UConn, in his work on walls, there was 275,000 miles of stone walls in England. And I have a boulder in my yard that is about a foot square, cubic foot. And they say a cubic foot of granite is about 165 pounds. So you look at how many cubic feet were in the Great Wall, and it was done by hand. It's still a remarkable accomplishment. And I think that's something as you look at the walls here in town, that they also are worthy of preservation. So thank you. I'll get your name after so I can make that correction there. Any others?
That's why I was hoping Jerry was going to be here with his dad to clear up.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, the old saying is building a wall, ox in a bay, 1 rod a day. Have you ever heard of that one?
What's that? Say it again.
To build a stone wall, an ox in a bay, 1 rod a day. That's the old saying.
Ox in a bay, 1 run a day.
1 rod a day.
1 rod a day.
I'm thinking,
10 feet? Yeah, I think it's like,
that's an old day.
60 feet, something like that.
Yeah, that's an old day.
Yeah, that's one of the other things that I share. My folks my ancestors went to Vermont, and a lot of the old, it turns out that the things that we say are Yankee pronunciations really reflect going back to England, that they were isolated and their speech patterns didn't change. So we're hearing Old English from the parts of England that they came from. Looking at some of the houses and the barns that are out there, for example, up just beyond the shipping place on Walker Road, there's a barn foundation that you look at the stones and they're massive, and you say, look at the amount of labor that went into building house, or building a foundation, building the places that we now walk in the woods and we see those old foundations, and there's stories there to be preserved. Yes, I saw yeah.
This is a little different track, but I have a couple of technical questions, I guess. From your research, so how do you know, or why do you think there were 160 cattle?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I have another, add-on from that. But
160 actually came from Governor Winthrop's journal that he was commenting on. He wrote in his journal that
Right.
Mr. Hooker and most of his congregation and 160 cows.
Okay.
And they were supposed to have lived off of drinking the milk for 100 miles. I don't think they lived solely on the milk, that the cows needed to be milked. That would certainly slow them down on your journey. Yeah,
Right.
you had
Do you know how many were lost, or why they were lost? Anything about that?
No, that's one of the hard things, that these folks weren't journal writers, so we don't have those kinds of records.
Okay.
What we do have is the fact that, I kind of grew up at the time, you remember when, like you see on TV, the Westerns, and every week the Indians would come down off the hills, they'd circle the wagons, that it was pretty nasty. The native population here had been, like 80–90% of it had died off. So there was much land available. And they generally were friendly, at least at the start. The chief down at Hartford went on up to Boston in 1630 and invited people to come down and live with them in Connecticut. His descendants are probably regretting that.
Okay. The reason I asked that is because one of our family, more than one of our family names were in one of your slides. And what I've read is that our ancestor was Richard Lyman, and he lost a lot of his cows on that track, on their travel from, in 1636, I think it was with Hooker, if I understand it right, and he was so depressed, he didn't get over that once they settled in Hartford, and he died a couple years later. That notation, I think, is from Reverend Elliott's, because he'd been a member of that church group or congregation, not Reverend Hooker's.
Okay, so there were other groups that came at different times. There were, this migration was, I think, really well thought out. And it actually was, the planning was going on very likely in England before they even got here.
Yes, I understand. There was a relationship between Hooker and Elliott.
John Elliott was Thomas Hooker's assistant in England, and lived with the Hookers at the Cuckoo's Farm in England. So yes, there was a close relationship. There were the Dorchester group that came down and primarily to Windsor, and then the group from Newtown that came to Hartford, and then there were the Watertown groups that went to Wethersfield. They didn't all come as one big massive surge. The group that came with Thomas Hooker might have been the larger group, but they came later. There were advanced groups that went. And one of the groups that came down in September 1635, and they came probably in the midst or shortly after they had a great hurricane that was comparable as massive as the 1938 hurricane, but they had no warning. So there are stories of groups that went at a different time that had great difficulty. Hooker's group, they would have been coming in early June, and you could see that by then the streams would be down, the winters were longer, and there were times that they didn't have a summer. They had snow in July, they had record of. The climate was much colder, so June was probably about the optimal time for travel. So it might have been that they came at an earlier time, or an earlier time in the seasons. I haven't heard that story, but I think that's where it's good to be able to try and tease these things out to add to the lore of the coming of people to Connecticut. Anyone else? Yes?
I just wondered, that last aerial photo there with the misty,
Yeah, I'll go back to that. That one's a beauty.
where is that?
That's by, first of all, I got to give credits to, and I did way down the corner here it's an aerial photo by Leslie Sweetnam, lives over in Woodstock, and his home is right on the path, so I get to talk with him. I think this is out looking more towards the Quinnebog Valley, but it's it could be, I took it as a stand-in for the majesty that must have been as you came here in the early years. Connecticut this area is extraordinarily beautiful. And as I made my confession up front, and what I knew about Ashford before with the motel, boy, I'm glad I learned something, because it's worth folks getting off the highway. You don't need to go to Maine or New Hampshire. They're great places, but come on down and explore here. What I've done on bring your attention to it, the website that I've created, and it has, gosh, I haven't figured out how to do a short name for it so it comes up easily. If you go to Google and you type Old Connecticut Path, it'll come up with a list of all sorts of Old Connecticut Path things, and one of them will be the website. One of the things that I've done in this project, and it's gone through several phases of taking pictures, exploring, mapping. Then I went into doing videos, which you can access through the website. I think there are 5 of them showing the different segments going across Ashford. So if you go to the website and you want to just kind of do a video tour and see some of the places that are along the way, you can. I've created a page that has links to driving tours. I figure there are folks who might want to come and visit, and that will take you from Webster on down to the Willimantic River. A long path leads through Westford, over Westford Hill, and a series of walks that you can go on. And they're also available if you have a smartphone, which I'm just learning how to use. You can go on there, and there's a smartphone application that you can walk and use that to help guide you. For more information, visit the Old Connecticut Path website